Well, all right. How's everybody doing? This is our video teaching for Matthew week 9. Thank y'all for being so flexible and willing to pivot since we extended this class for a long time. But I'm super excited to share a whole bunch of Matthew with you and hopefully learn some stuff. And this will be super valuable and more accessible because you don't have to sit down and listen to me talk for a whole hour and a half. This is something you can pick up and watch kind of whenever you want. So let's pray and then we'll get started. So Father God, thank you for your word. Thank you for this class. Thank you for all that you do. Lord, move through us to bring your kingdom. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. So we're picking up where we left off at the end of Matthew 13. If you remember last week, we went through the 8 parables in Matthew 13. Took a long time, but was super rich. I'm super glad we got to do it. So, Matthew 13, and what we're going to start is in verse 53, which says, "When Jesus had finished these parables, he left there. He went to his hometown and began to teach them in their synagogue. So they were astonished and said, 'How did this wisdom and these miracles come to him? Isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and his sisters? Aren't they all with us? So where does he get all these things?' And they were offended by him. But Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown and in his household.' And he did not do many miracles there because of their unbelief." Now, Matthew really condenses as part of the story, and it could be that this is a different story, as we talked about in the class before. Like, this goal of this class isn't to try to necessarily harmonize all 4 of the gospel stories together, but every now and then we need to have the conversation of trying to take these 4 different accounts and see how they fit together. It is possible that these are 2 different accounts or 2 different events or 2 different visits to Nazareth. It reads to me that this is most likely a condensed version of the more full version that we have in Luke's gospel. So we're going to jump over to Luke chapter 4. We're going to look at verses 14 to 30, which say, "Jesus returned to Galilee in the power of the Spirit, and news about him spread through the whole countryside. He was teaching in their synagogues, and everyone praised him. He went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. He stood up to read. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him." Okay. Jesus goes home, and we've talked briefly about the synagogue in class before. But basically the way a synagogue works is it's like your local church, right? The temple is in Jerusalem. That's like the main place you go. But every town would have a synagogue that would have a rabbi, a priest, something like that there. And you would go to temple on Shabbat. And the thing that's different about a Shabbat service from our normal Sunday service was it would probably be about 80%, 88% reading of the text, and then a little bit of commentary at the end. And this would actually be the only synagogue that Jesus would have read the text in, because this is the synagogue that he grew up in. You see, there's this thing called a parashah reading, and everyone in the town, at least every male in the would be assigned to read a portion every so often. You go through the parashah every 52 weeks. Okay? 52 weeks, 1 year, 1 year's worth of reading, get through the Torah. Now, the other books, the Haftarah was like a 3-year cycle. That would be the Ketuvim, the Ne'evim, the prophets, and the writings. So we can probably safely assume that Jesus is in Nazareth because it's his turn to read the text. Now, he's handed Isaiah. Was this his parashah assignment? Or did he have the Haftarah assignment? If he's got the Haftarah, it's not in the book of Moses, it's Isaiah. So it couldn't be the parashah reading. Let's pick up where we left off. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. Now, what's interesting here is that we have not found this text in a Haftarah record. There's two main Haftarah records. There's the Babylonian and there's the Palestinian, what we would call the Jewish Talmud. There was also their lectionary. That's they had two different lectionaries. They're very similar, but they were also different. There's no reference to any other lectionary Haftarah readings, but none of them is the passage that Jesus reads as a part of the Haftarah reading, which is interesting because what we don't know was his portion before this portion? Was it something altogether different and he just decides to read this portion? Are these the only verses that he reads? Because of these that he read, not only are these not his assigned reading, but he chose a very, very, very select group of verses here to read. And then, drops the mic, sits down, does his thing. He sat down and then he says, the text says, "The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, 'Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing.'" Now that's what we would call the drash. Remember those helpful Jewish hermeneutic terms we came with, the derashah. I was getting ahead of myself. It sounds like the drash. We've talked about the drash. The derashah is a short sermon, usually somewhere between 30 to 90 seconds long. They read the text for 30 to 40 minutes. They get up and give a 90-second sermon, which is the flip-flop of the experience that you get in our normal Sunday gatherings all across America. And Jesus' 90-second sermon today is, "Today the scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." And then Luke notes, "All spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips." "Isn't this Joseph's son?" they asked. All spoke well of him, which is a really key part of this whole passage. I find the part that we all just read over and don't catch. Matthew doesn't give the impression when you read it, and yet Luke seems like he says he goes up, sets up shop, and the whole point of Matthew is in a hometown is the place where a prophet is not honored. Yet in Luke, he goes to his hometown. He basically says, "I'm the guy. I'm here to usher in the kingdom. Today this prophecy is fulfilled in your hearing." And everybody speaks well of him. The synagogue was abuzz. Everybody is like, "Oh man, that's our guy. That's Jesus, hometown boy." Nazareth, Netzer, was basically, that name means Shootville. When people say, "Can anything good come from Nazareth?" part of it is because people viewed it with disdain because they had the arrogance to name their village Shootville in reference to the shoot that would come from Jesse's stump. They thought they were going to be the place the Messiah came from, and everybody looked at them with, "Man, those arrogant hillbillies over there in Nazareth." When Jesus says this, people seem to be on board. But let's keep reading. Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself.' And you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we heard you did in Capernaum.'" So basically he's saying, you want me to do all the hometown miracles, you want the special hometown treatment. Jesus is going to go on to say, that's not happening. "Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to the widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon." That's a Gentile woman he's speaking of. When they hear this, they're wanting, the hometown treatment. And Jesus says, no, no, no. I tell you, Elijah didn't go to his hometown. Elijah went to Phoenicia, to the pagans. In Phoenicia, that's really bad. That's like the capital of Baal worship. And he found a widow in Phoenicia to actually heal and minister to. He goes on to say, and there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha, the prophet. Yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian, a Syrian and a Phoenician. Jesus is very explicitly, I'm here doing a work for the outsiders, with Matthew's agenda again being the mumser. Jesus says, you don't understand. I'm here to pronounce the year of Jubilee that he just read from Isaiah, the year of the Lord's favor, but I'm not here to announce it for you. I'm here to announce it for them. And now things change. Picking the text up again, all the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off. Which, by the way, this is how one starts a stoning. They take you out to stone you, and they're furious. They grab Jesus, they take him outside of town, and what you do is you usually hog tie him, tie their hands and feet. So you push them off of some high building or a cliff, and sometimes the fall will break their neck and basically kill them, and then everyone grabs a stone, and you stand usually at the top of the ledge if you're close enough, and you can throw your stones. Anyone that thinks that this person is guilty after the two witnesses have brought their case. If they survive, according to Torah, that's God passing of his judgment. If he dies, then that's God's judgment. They took him out to stone him. But, picking up text again, he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. We picture Jesus passing through, everybody trying to grab him, but nobody can. But we don't know. From a Jewish perspective, they could have brought Jesus to the top of this cliff, to the top of the ledge. And what do they need? We just talked about it. They need two people to bear witness. Somebody has to say he's done this wrong. And the reality is Jesus has done nothing that deserves capital punishment. He's not broken any laws. People are Superman. They don't like what they're hearing, but he's done nothing wrong. I picture Jesus saying, who has an accusation? Anybody? Nobody? Picture him motioning to the disciples saying, all right, well, let's go. And just walks through the crowd because there's nothing they can do about it. Let's go on to Matthew 14. At that time, this is chapter 14, verse 1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch had heard of the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, this is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why powers are at work in him. Now Herod had arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered John a prophet. So John the Baptist is an Old Testament prophet. And what was an Old Testament prophet's job was to go and speak God's judgment, God's law, God's word to people in power, and to the people in general. The reason that John has a problem here is Herod is breaking the Torah by taking his brother's wife. And the reason that we have a problem here is that Herod Antipas has this weird relationship with John, because we're told in other passages that he loves to listen to him and talk to him and hear from him. And at the same time, John the Baptist is not going to go back on, you can't marry your brother's wife. You're taking your brother's wife, and Leviticus says you can't do it because of how it robs people. It robs your brother, let alone it robs the woman in the story. And maybe his brother was okay with it. Maybe the woman was okay with it. We don't know. But under Leviticus, John has to confront him because that's what prophets do. Moving on. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for the guests and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head on a platter, the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed, but because of his oath and his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl who carried it to her mother. John, oh, I'm so sorry. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it. Then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Again, we are not sure if John the Baptist is Jesus' rabbi, but he is his cousin. And Jesus' response is, I've got to get away. I've got to create space to grieve, to mourn, to talk to the Father. We love to talk about the verse about how Jesus wept with Lazarus, and we just sometimes overlook how many places we actually see Jesus' humanity on display, modeling for us what it means to engage in struggle and pain and loss and emotion. Let's keep reading. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is one of the best known stories in the gospel accounts. Now, keep in mind, we just had a class where we talked all about parables in this deep rabbinical teaching, and then we get this story. And I don't want us to move too quickly past that because everything about a rabbi's life is instructive. Everything Jesus does is teaching. Everything he does is with intention and purpose. Jesus is a typical rabbi, and everything he does is done with an incredible level of rabbinic intentionality. Every move he makes on purpose. Every passage that he quotes for a reason. Now, if we read this in John, which we're going to do, it's in John chapter 6. I like a couple of the details that it adds here. See, this is not just in the synoptic gospels, it's also in John. It shows up in all 5. And that makes, or all 4 gospels. That makes it super important. So, John chapter 6. Therefore, when Jesus looked up and noticed a huge crowd coming toward him, he asked Philip, "Where will we buy bread so these people can eat?" He asked this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. So also, why is it difficult to find bread? Well, according to John's account, it's Passover season in this story, which means that people would not have bread just laying around. They would have removed all the yeast from their house because it's Passover time. Okay, so Jesus is a rabbi. We've talked about that a lot. When he starts this process, he knows what he wants to accomplish. This isn't Jesus feeding 5,000 people just because they don't have dinner. Jesus wants to teach his disciples something. Of course, we're familiar with this story. He tells the disciples to feed the crowd. They kind of go, "Jesus, how are we supposed to do that? And we only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes." Jesus responds to and says, "Just have the people sit down," blesses the provision, and begins to distribute. Well, the disciples begin to distribute the food. So they started with 7. Oh, a lot of people think that this takes place here, same place that we saw our Sermon on the Mount take place. I don't know if there's any definitive proof that's where it takes place, but that's what most people think. Excuse me for a second. Great. All right. So, what's weird about this story? What jumps out at you that seems like a detail that's way too specific to just be there? This is the part of the class where we'd have a discussion. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you there's a lot of numbers in this story. A lot of numbers. And we've mentioned before that numbers symbolize things. So I have on this next slide a breakdown of some of the biblical number stuff, okay? So what we have here, let's break down. Number 1, God. What set the Israelites apart from the other nations around them? Monotheism. 1, God. 2, when we think of 2, what did Moses bring down the mountain? 2 stone tablets, right? Representing the law. 3, community. We see this all over the place. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. The divisions in the Israelites, the Levites, and the Kohanim, the priests. The Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. 4, Gentiles. Why? 4 corners of the earth, north, south, east, west. It's directional and it refers to the whole world. 5, it represents grace because 5 represents the Torah. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That was God's grace giving the law to us. 6 is sin, sinful man. Okay. 7 has a double meaning. It has a Jewish meaning and a non-Jewish meaning. When we see 7, we think of creation, we think of completeness, but also we're told in Joshua about the 7 nations that were going to be in the land. So 7 pagan nations is one way to look at 7, and 7 being completion or creation is the other way to look at it. It just depends on what context it's being used. 8 is this idea of new creation or a reset. It becomes an idea of infinity. If you notice the infinity symbol that we have is just an 8 flipped on its side. 9 has to do with inspection. 9 fruits of the spirit, other things like that. Now 10, we've got complete community. 3 plus 7. 7 is completeness. 3 is community. 3 plus 7, perfect community, complete community. 11, imperfection. 5, law, plus 6, man. Man's law is imperfect. And then 12, government. Think 12 tribes of Israel. Think 12 disciples. Governmental. Okay? And you're probably looking at me and going, Jeremy, this seems like Bible code. Just stay with me. Just stay with me and see what you think by the end of this, okay? So a lot of these numbers are very Jewish numbers. 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, very, very Jewish numbers. 12. And then we have some that are Gentile. 4, 6, 7 can be a Gentile number. So Joshua 3:10, that God names the 7 pagan nations. Now let's take a look at these numbers again in the story that we just read. This is a story full of Jewish numbers, 5 to 1,000, which 1,000 is 10 times 10 times 10, which is really 3 tens. It's just like the community on steroids. 1,000 is a way of saying all of them, in essence, nobody's missing. If we apply this understanding to the book, or not to the book, to the story, look at what happens to the teaching that we have here. Jesus takes the law, 5 books of Moses, 2 stone tablets of Moses. So by the way, 5 plus 2 is 7, which is completeness. The complete law. He gives his 12 disciples the complete law to feed the people of God. And we know that these are Jewish people because of the side of the lake he's on, and there's 5,000. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. A 5 community. Torah people. Bible people. He's in the triangle. That's who's there. Yes. So, Jesus has 5,000 men, not counting women and children. He's got people of the Torah. He takes the law, this law of Torah, and he gives it to his disciples who give it to the people. When the people take and eat the law that they receive from Jesus, there is more than enough. And how many baskets do they pick up? They pick up 12 baskets, one for each of them. We also have some cool shades of Ruth chapter 2 here, if you would like to go research that too. I'll just leave that little homework assignment there. So we have all this stuff about the law. What else is interesting here is he has them sit down in groups of 50. And we've seen this somewhere else in the Bible. If you go all the way back to the Exodus, when Jethro is visiting Moses, he advises Moses that he can't judge all these people by himself, and he has him divide up the people in groups of 50s, hundreds, and thousands. We talked a whole bunch about how Jesus is being presented as the second Moses here. And once again, he is on a mount distributing symbols that represent the law to the people. Let's pause here for a second. Maybe you're looking at this numbers business and you're going, all right, Jeremy, I'm not sold on that. That's fine. Let's talk about something more practical. Everybody gets wound up in going about this miracle, right? Multiplying food is a very, very useful, very, very crazy miracle. But I mean, we believe it happened. So, I mean, but how many of us worry about where our daily provision is going to come from, or what's around the corner, or what the future holds? I would say all of us would raise our hand for that. And then I guess I'd ask, then who cares if you believe that a miracle happened? Because all the demons that were on the hillside believe that Jesus did a miracle that day. They shudder when Jesus' name is spoken, is what James says. Why do we care that a miracle happened if it doesn't actually change the way that we live? If we live with an ayin ra and think that there's not enough, or think that our God's not going to provide for us. We get really wound up about the accuracy and the infallibility and this and that, and having proper theology and proper doctrine, and all that stuff's important. And yes, there's going to be people that do you actually believe he fed 5,000 people? And I say sure. But the better question is, do you believe that he fed 5,000 people, and then does it make a difference in the way that you live your everyday life? Do you believe that God is your provider? Do you believe that Jesus' teaching is enough? Do you believe that when you let Jesus interpret the law and trust in his way and his teaching and follow him, that he's going to have enough for you? If we go back to the Old Testament, Elisha once feeds 100 people, which is, a measly group compared to its 5,000. So this is a cool story. I love this story. But let's keep moving because we're on a time limit here. Matthew 14. We're starting in verse 22. Immediately, there's that sense of urgency. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had dismissed them, he went off on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. I have the disciples out on the chaos waters yet again. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. Here's Jesus hovering over the chaos waters. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink and cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, there's that urgency, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of the place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak, his tallit, and all who touched it were healed. The first century concept of discipleship was such that the most successful thing you can do in Jewish culture was to study the Torah. One of the pinnacle experiences of the Jewish schooling system was being given the opportunity to become Talmudim, or as we say it, disciple. If you thought you had what it takes as a student of the Torah, you would apply for discipleship under a rabbi. One of the greatest honors a boy could receive would be the acceptance of a rabbi to be his Talmud. If a rabbi chose you as a disciple, he was in essence saying to you, "I believe you have what it takes to become just like me." It was a great honor. The path of a disciple was a path of memorizing the rabbi's teachings, taking on the rabbi's set of interpretations, and most importantly, becoming like your rabbi. That meant you spent all day, every day, trying to replicate the thoughts, actions, and teachings of your teachers. Some Jewish scholars say they have seen a rabbi proceed into a bathroom, and in his wake are 10 or 12 young disciples. You want to be just like your rabbi. If your rabbi does it, you do it. You know that you can do it because you could not have done it. If you could not have done it, the rabbi would never have called you. A rabbi's call is his affirmation in your ability and your potential. Peter finds himself in a boat that night with the other disciples, and they end up encountering Jesus, who happens to be walking on the water. If Jesus is walking on the water, what does Peter want to do? He wants to be just like his rabbi. "Lord, if it's really you, call me out to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come," and Peter does. Peter gets a lot of flack for what happens next, but Peter was the only one that stepped out of the boat. Peter was the only one that walked on water. But Peter sees the wind and sees the waves, and he begins to sink. And why does he sink? Well, the answer that we've talked about for years is that he loses faith. He sees the winds and the waves, and he loses faith. But who does he lose his faith in? It doesn't seem like he loses his faith in Jesus. Jesus isn't sinking. Jesus is doing just fine. Does Peter lose faith in Jesus' ability to help him walk on the water? Or does Peter lose faith in himself? Jesus looks at him and says, "Oh, ye of little faith, why did you doubt?" Is this Jesus scolding Peter? Or is this a question, a legitimate question that Jesus is asking? Peter, if you didn't have what it takes to walk on water, I would have never called you out. I think Jesus is saying, Peter, you have everything you need to do the thing I'm calling you to do. And I believe in you, Peter. This is a quote from Rob Bell. I know lots of people have thoughts on Rob Bell, but Velvet Elvis is a great book. This is a quote from him. At the end of his time with his disciples, Jesus had some final words for them. He tells them to go to the ends of the earth and make more disciples. Then he leaves. He promises to send a spirit to guide them and give them power, but Jesus himself leaves the future of the movement in their hands. He doesn't stick around to make sure they don't screw it up. He's gone. He trusts that they can actually do it. This is not in the quote, but it is said that a rabbi only leaves his disciples, only calls the disciples his friends and his peers when they have all the things they need to carry on the ministry. God has an incredibly high view of people. God believes that people are capable of amazing things. I have been told that I need to believe in Jesus, which is something, which is a good thing. But what I'm learning is that Jesus also believes in me. I've been told that I need to have faith in God, which is a good thing. But what I'm learning is that God has faith in me. The rabbi thinks we can be like him. Been a dad for almost 17 years now. This is not Rob Bell quotes over. And I often will watch my kids and wonder when it was that I lost faith in myself. And I'm not talking about narcissism or trying to elevate my own standing in the world or a lack of humility or some pride issue. I truly and earnestly believe that the hope for all this world's brokenness lies in the power of a resurrected Christ and the reality of Jesus. But what I'm talking about, faith in myself that recognizes that you, Christian, are made in the image of God. The kind of faith that I might actually be willing to believe that this world is worth saving. It must be worth saving if God was willing to go to the cross for it. I wonder, as I've observed my kids growing up, how it is that innocence is somehow connected with confidence. Jesus tells us that if we were to watch little children for a while, it would probably do us some good. That if we cannot change to become like the children, that his kingdom might just be out of reach. One of the things you'll notice if you watch small children is they have incredible faith in themselves. They know that dad is there. Their mom is there. They know that they are loved, and they just want to play and laugh and smile, take risks. Seems like later on in life, we begin to question all those things. Is dad really there for me? And am I really worth loving? Am I good enough? Do you see me and do you love what you see? We try to do the things we know in our hearts we were created to do. We step out of the boat, we begin to walk. But when we know that the wind and the waves are out there, just waiting to sabotage our story in one fleeting moment of weakness, we sink. And the sad part is when we sink, it's not really surprising, is it? Because you have an accuser at your side whispering that we all knew it would happen just like this. There's no way you could ever have walked on water. So we tread water until we find a life preserver and we push back towards the boat. We hold our gaze to the floor and we prepare for the scolding that we know would come. But the scolding doesn't seem to come from Jesus. It seems to come from ourselves. Oh, me of little faith. Oh, me of big doubts. Oh, me, the failure. Oh, me who thought I was good enough to do these things. Oh, me, when will I ever learn? I should just get used to this and stay in the boat. Safer in here. I'm safe from humiliation and pain and failure. Next time I won't be so silly. But while we're sitting safe in the boat, we can't be dangerous for the kingdom. Jesus reaches his hand out to all of us and puts it on our shoulder and looks us in the eyes and says, you can do this. I literally made you to do this. Think about my kids when they were smaller and how they just thought they could do anything. Luckily, Lillian still thinks that she could do pretty much anything. They could be an artist, a musician, a superhero. And when they would play a game with their friends and it didn't turn out the way they expected, they pivot and try again or make something new and exciting out of it. They're never afraid to ask me things, oftentimes outrageous things. I want to learn how to play and be bold. And I would never suggest that we trivialize sin. I'm not saying that failure is okay and God doesn't care about the calling on our lives. I'm not one of the Jesus followers who seems to throw God's grace around like it's a get out of jail free card. In fact, I've noticed it's the very fact that I take my sin so seriously that I end up being so incapacitated. But there's something that we're supposed to learn from the children. There's something about them that's going to bring us closer to the kingdom of heaven. And I'm tired of being immobilized by my failures. I'm tired of being the guy who knows there's no way he can pull this off. I'm tired of having a long list of excuses. I'm tired of wondering whether or not my Father is there for me. I'm tired of debating myself on whether I'm worthy of being loved. I'm tired of worrying about what the world wants from me, thinks about me, or says about me. Yes, we'll have problems, we'll have sins, we'll have issues that we will have to deal with. We're going to have to get over them. We're going to have to find a way to overcome them. But the Spirit of God is trying to complete a work in all of us that he started a long time ago. Yes, I have some failing to do, but I have plenty of getting up to do too. I have a salvation that I need to work out with fear and with trembling, and it's going to take effort. It's not going to be easy. But I wonder if God would rather have us sit in a boat saying, oh, me of little faith, or if he'd rather sit on a park bench and watch us try to figure it out. The same way I used to sit and watch my kids play. We're going to make it. We're just going to be so glad to spend the day with our dad. To be loved. To be seen. And to know that our Father loves what he sees. That we're going to be okay. All right. Let's move on. That was a good place to end, but we got to keep going. Matthew chapter 15. Then some Pharisees and teachers of the law came to Jesus from Jerusalem and asked, is that... Oh, hold on. Well, it's important that they came from Jerusalem. So these are not Galilean Pharisees, which means they're going to be more apt to be sympathetic to the Sadducee worldview. They're going to be way more Judean. So instead of backwoods, charismatic, hillbilly Galileans, my people, not the Pharisees in Galilee were uneducated. They were very educated. But these are different. These are sophisticated This is sophisticated Judeans, and this will be important for the context. All right. So these Pharisees from Jerusalem ask, why do your disciples break the tradition of the elders? They don't wash their hands before they eat. So important to note here. What do they call it? The tradition of the elders. So does that mean that this is Torah? It does not. This is not Torah. This is part of that oral tradition, the halakha, the walk, which is going to eventually be part of the Mishnah, which ends up becoming the Talmud that we referred to a couple weeks ago. You had these 613, remember 613 commands, and they built a fence around those of 3,000 commands, and they built another fence around those of another 3,000 commands. Yes. Jesus replied, why do you break the command of God for the sake of your tradition? For God said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father and mother is to be put to death. But you say that if anyone declares that what might have been used to help their father or mother is devoted to God, they are not to honor their father and mother with it. Thus, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition. Jesus thinks critically about this oral tradition. He doesn't just follow these rules because most of the community does. And I'm not saying that Jesus never followed these rules. I would assume that Jesus follows some of the halakha. In fact, I would probably even posture that Jesus and his disciples wash their hands most of the time. They probably just aren't following all of the dottings of the I's and crossing of the T's, and maybe they don't do it at certain times just to prove a point. Jesus seems to look at the elders and say, listen, sometimes you guys are making decisions and rulings about our behavior that aren't aligned with what is taught in the text. And when they don't align with the written record, with the written revelation, with the Logos word, I ain't doing it. Jesus gives them quite a stinging critique and says, you've actually used your traditions to get around what is at times the very heart of the Torah. Of course, in our church system today, we never come up with loopholes. Continuing on in the text, you nullify the word of God for the sake of your tradition, you hypocrites. Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. This is very rabbinic of him. Matthew is quoting Jesus, pulling from the whole section of laws. There's a particular law Jesus is talking about here regarding the father and mother, but it is a whole Torah portion that is about the laws that come right after the commandments come down from Mount Sinai. What I'm telling you is it's in the text. Let's see, Exodus 21:15 and Exodus 21:17. Whoever strikes his father or his mother must be put to death. And there's this little thing in between about kidnapping. Then he goes to whoever curses his father or mother must be put to death. This whole section, 21:4-24, is laws. The interesting thing is that Jesus points back to laws about people. If you read the subtext or if you read the subtitles in the text, we get laws about personal injury. We get laws about theft, crops, personal property, the vulnerable, and all these laws about people. Whereas the traditions that he's calling out here are really about your own little thing, not so much how to protect people. That might be slightly relevant for the world that we live in. We just love to come up with all kinds of things that we deem as incredibly important. And in the meantime, along the way, we seem to just step over people. Just refer to everything we talked about earlier in the Sermon on the Mount, all that Jesus agenda stuff. So let's talk about the law for a second. Because we get to Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and just kind of zone out, trudge through it, and going. Because the law becomes this really kind of sticky thing. Because you have the Ten Commandments. I think we can all agree the Ten Commandments are great. We're talking about in Exodus 20, they reference the laws as being this ability to comment and unpack those 10 commandments. Think of the 10 commandments as kind of like that page at the front of the book that gives you chapter titles, and then the rest of the commandments, the rest of the law is kind of breaking down the subtext in those 10 commandments, right? There's a whole lot of questions to ask yourself then about what this whole section of the law is. Where has it happened before? And what is it trying to reference? And when we jump all the way into Matthew, what is Jesus trying to get these Pharisees to understand? Because they know their text. Let's talk about that verse in the middle. Is there anything particularly important about the kidnapping verse that lies in the middle of those two references in Exodus? Because there's some rabbinic commentary on why there'd be these two verses out of order. It has to do with the way that we are engaging in treating our mother and father as if we rob and steal from them. The expression of to kidnap is definitely an expression used to steal one's name. It's hard to explain with our Western understanding and our Western language, but the Hebrew expression is you're robbing. To kidnap is just taking the physicality of the person. The idea is that you're robbing their actual essence and identity as a person, which just goes along exactly with what we were saying here. I'm looking at these two verses that Jesus quotes, the honor your father and mother. And it's great because if you curse your father and mother, what are you doing? In essence, is really robbing them of their dignity, which is what you're doing if you then go on to refuse them something that you could give them to take care of them, but don't because you have to offer the sacrifice. Let's keep reading. Jesus called the crowd to him and said, listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of the mouth, that is what defiles them. Then the disciples came to him and asked, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? Do you know that? He replied, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by the roots. Leave them. They are blind guides. If the blind lead the blind, both will fall into a pit. Peter said, explain the parable to us. Are you still so dull? Jesus asked him. You know, I've looked at this before. I'm not sure Matthew was originally written in Greek. That's an unpopular opinion. I don't exactly know what to do with that because I wasn't there. So I don't hear Jesus' tone. I don't see his heart. But it seems out of character for him to be like, Peter, you're dumb. We can talk that another time. Jesus continues, don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and out of the body? The things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these defile them. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defiles a person. But eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. This is great because in a very practical sense, touching unclean things, eating that does make you unclean. Even in the books of Moses, in the Torah, Jesus is like, that's not the point. The point is people and where your heart is. That is actually what drives all this other stuff. Out of the heart is where all these actions are going to come. Out of your heart is what you actually believe about people, and it drives how you treat people in the first place. And so that is where the cleanliness lies. Jesus is getting more practical and more practical. Now, this is a quote from one of the rabbis that pointed out the law section of these stories and those laws that become commentary on those stories are speaking to complex human experiences. Again, it's back to this human component that Jesus invites us into. Just one moment. Okay. Leaving that place, Jesus withdrew excuse me, to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. Jesus did not answer a word, so his disciples came to him and urged him, send her away before she keeps crying out after us. He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The woman came and knelt before him. Lord, help me, she said. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Yes, it is, Lord, she said. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. This girl has got some chutzpah, y'all. Then Jesus said to her, Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed at that moment. So Jesus was just over this way. Not over this way. Down here in the triangle, up above the Galilee. Now he's way up here trying to get away, trying to get, John the Baptist has been beheaded. We just read that at the beginning, and he's been trying to get away ever since he heard that. And the place he goes is this pagan nation, Tyre and Sidon. But what's interesting is, what does Matthew call her? He doesn't call her a Sidonian or a Syrophoenician. He calls her a Canaanite. But if you were in Mark, he calls her a Syrophoenician, because Mark's audience is the Romans, but Matthew's is the Jews. He calls her a Canaanite to make a point that she is an outsider, a mumser. He's drumming up these images from our Torah readings about the Canaanites, right? Jesus is in Syrophoenicia. He's trying to rest. That's what he's been looking for. A mere 2 verses until someone comes up asking for his attention. There's this Gentile Canaanite woman, and she begins to beg Jesus to heal her daughter, but Jesus ignores her. Again, this isn't like Jesus goes and came onto the scene and then cast out every demon, healed every lame person, healed every blind person. He's trying to pull away. He's trying to catch his breath. His cousin's just been murdered. Maybe he is a rabbi. What's interesting is that Jesus doesn't even say anything, to the point where this woman is following them around saying things that the disciples were like, can we do something? Can we just get rid of this woman? What are we doing? Deal with this, Jesus. And what's interesting is, instead of rebuking his disciples, Jesus turns around and tells her he has not come to help the Gentiles. But he's been preaching about the Gentiles all throughout this book, and he's healed a couple of Gentiles. The demonized man at the Gadarene, or the Gadarene demoniac, the centurion's servant. Like, he's done this before. It's almost like he's trying to prove a point. She continues to beg him. She's got some chutzpah, some moxie. The rabbi has now addressed her twice. He's ignored you, and now he's addressed you. He reiterates his response as she continues to beg him. Only this time, he uses what seems to us to be super strong language. And we talked about this during the Sermon on the Mount. He says, it's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Let's talk about the context here. We talked about how the Jewish people, the Hebrews, referred to Gentiles as animals: birds, fish, pigs, dogs. It reads like a derogatory reference, but this is very typical Jewish slang. We're not first century people. We don't live in the Middle East. It's all very foreign to us. Jesus is saying quite clearly, I am here for the Jewish people. Trying to catch my breath, but the woman will not have it. She says, yes, Lord, maybe I am a dog, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. And Jesus takes a step back. His response is, woman, you have great faith. And he grants her request. So what just took place here? What about The statement that gets Jesus to turn his opinion on his head in a single sentence. This is where it gets kind of sticky theologically. Because Jesus, we hold to that Jesus was fully God, fully man. That he set aside his divinity to take on humanity, to live here in the dust as one of us. To move from a place of sympathy to empathy. It says that Jesus grew in wisdom, stature, and favor. So does Jesus learn things? I think that's something we can talk about. I would never take away from Jesus' divinity or his divine nature. Jesus is 100% divine, and I affirm historic Christian orthodoxy. But I also believe that Philippians 2 very clearly tells us that Jesus set his God nature aside and came to earth to function as a man. While he was God, he did not consider equality with God, Philippians said, something to be held onto. The proper translation would say something to grasp or hold onto, but he set it aside and came here as a man. The new NIV says, not something to be used to his advantage. Some of the slides Jesus said, I could do that, but that's not how I'm going to work here. That's not what I've come to do. There's a couple more references Jesus says in the Gospel of John, everything I've learned, the actual Greek, if you look at it, at that is everything I've learned. Some translations will say everything I have been given, I've passed on to you. The actual Greek is everything I have learned from my Father I've made known to you. There's a passage in Hebrews that talks about how Jesus had to learn obedience in the Greek. Jesus is a learner. It doesn't mean he was sinful, but it means he learned things. Which, I mean, he had to learn to walk. He had to learn to talk. The idea of Jesus had to be potty trained at some point in time. Because those aren't sinful things. Jesus was without sin, but Jesus came to earth as a human, as a baby. I believe the idea that Jesus learned things is important here. Because it seems like this moment is kind of like a turning point in Jesus' ministry. Because up to this point, his agenda, by and large, has been the Jews. The times he's encountered Gentiles has either been on Jewish turf or he's taken the disciples to a Gentile area to teach them something, right? So what gets Jesus' attention? You know, I bet it's in the text. All right, let's look at this on a Peshat level. She says, the children's bread, the crumbs fall to the dogs. Number one, it sounds like she's saying they have the same master, which is a big deal for a Syrophoenician woman, a Canaanite woman. Now let's go to the Remiz. So where we're going is 1 Kings 17, verses 7 through 16. After a while, the wadi had dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him. The him here is our boy Elijah, the king of Hutzbah himself. Get up, go to Zarephath that belongs to Sidon and stay there. Where is he going? Sidon. The exact place that Jesus is right now. Now, we Gentiles read our New Testaments and we don't pay attention to geography because who could care less? He's not just with the Gentiles. He's in a very specific place that other things have happened. So that means that they don't put these things in there just as fun little details. It means that they mean something. Let's keep going. Look, I've commanded a woman who is a widow to provide for you there. Elijah got up and went to Zarephath. When he arrived at the city gate, there was a widow woman gathering wood. Elijah called her and said, please bring me a little water in a cup and let me drink. As she went to get it, he called her and said, please bring me a piece of bread in your hand. But she said, as the Lord your God lives, I do not have anything baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a bit of oil in the jug. Just now I'm gathering a couple of sticks in order to go prepare it for myself and my son so that we may eat it and die. And Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go and do as you have said, only make me a small loaf from it and bring it out here to me. Afterwards, you may make some for yourself and for your son, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Ooh, sorry, guys. The flour jar will not become empty, and the oil jug will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the surface of the land. So she proceeded to do according to the word of Elijah. She and he and her household ate for many days. The flour jar did not become empty, and the oil jug did not run dry, according to the word of the Lord he had spoken through Elijah. All right. So Elijah and this widow in Zarephath basically survived on a starvation ration, as most scholars would say it. This is not like, oh yeah, they had tons of bread to eat every day. They had barely enough bread to eat. That is just enough. They had just enough bread to eat. This story is literally about a widow who eats crumbs. Literally eats crumbs. And Elijah is the first person in the text to be connected to what word? By the way, Jesus just talked about this story in Nazareth at the synagogue. He was talking about Elijah and the widow of Zarephath, and he ends up being here, and she's asking for crumbs. Elijah is the first person to be connected with the word master. The word master in Hebrew is the same root word that rabbi comes from. In Jewish thought, the first rab, the first master, the first rabbi with a Talmudim was Elijah and Elisha. Elijah has always been connected to the idea of master. Who was the first master? The first master was Elijah when she says, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. It seems like she knows her text. She knows this story that happened here. She's heard Jesus, but even Phoenician widows eat starvation ration crumbs from Elijah's table. Jesus goes, oh my goodness, woman, you have amazing faith. This woman in the story of Jesus knows her text, and it blows him away. Now, we're going to talk about numbers a couple more times. And I've asked you to consider that Jesus learned things. So I know already I'm starting to get flagged on YouTube. There's a lot of things that are like, I'm sure you're feeling this, like, Jeremy, this is hard teaching. I don't know if I'm on board with this. And this is all pencil. All pencil. You don't have to believe this. Like I said, we can disagree on some of these things, and it's fine. But we're going to keep going. Let's do a little bit of, well, actually, it's not. Well, yeah, let's do it. Let's do a little bit of recapping, just because we've been talking for a while. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. So we had the woman in Tyre and Sidon. We just talked about that. He's going back from that region. He's coming and he goes on his way back. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Now, along the Sea of Galilee, I'm going to go back to, the map's still here. Find Tyre and Sidon. And then if you point that out, you can actually look. He's going to walk. He's coming back from that far northwestern region. He's coming down along the Sea of Galilee. From the gospel accounts, we know that he's headed into the region of the Decapolis. We've talked about the Decapolis before. The one time that we've been here, we've said there was one story where Jesus was here. This is the second time he's going to show up here. The first story was one we just talked about, or just mentioned. It's the Gadarene demoniac. The demoniac in the pigs. That was the first time, and this is the second time that Jesus has come back here. And why is he coming here from Syrophoenicia, from Tyre and Sidon? I think we were just talking about this. I think this encounter with this Canaanite woman, with the Syrophoenician woman, has inspired him to be more intentional with the Gentiles. He heads straight to the Decapolis. This time we're told, as we pointed out with that episode with the demoniac, this time when he comes, there's going to be 4,000 people coming to greet him. Before, we just had one demonized guy and a bunch of people asking him to get out of there. Now he comes back and there's 4,000 people. The demoniac that Jesus said to stay and tell your story did his job. Praise God. Matthew 15, starting in verse 29. Jesus left there and went along the Sea of Galilee. Then he went up on a mountainside and sat down. Great crowds came to him, bringing the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others, and laid them at his feet, and he healed them. The people were amazed when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the God of Israel. Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. I do not want to send them away hungry, or they may collapse on the way. His disciples answered, Where could we get enough bread in this remote place to feed such a crowd? How many loaves do you have? Jesus said. 7, they replied, and a few small fish. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and when he had given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and they in turn to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciple picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000 men, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went into the vicinity of Magadan. Excuse me just a second. Okay, time to review our numbers yet again. So there they are. I'm not going to name them out. I added an additional one, which, well, I haven't added one. I'm just going to talk about 40. 40 is testing, trial. You think about 10 is community, 4 is directional, right? 40 days of rain in the flood, 40 years in the desert, 40 days in the wilderness for Jesus. So, I don't think we need to go all the way through those numbers again. We just have them there. 4,000. Where are we geographically? The Decapolis. Pagans. So we are not in the people of the 5 books, not in the people of the Torah. This isn't the 5,000, it's the 4,000. And 4 is the number of Gentiles, the 4 corners of the compass, the 4 corners of the earth. Of course, it says a Gentile group of people is 4,000 people. We consider that context. Jesus has now returned for the second and final time, as we're told, to the region of the Decapolis. He could have went more, but as far as what's in our text, this is the second and final time he will be in the Decapolis. This time he feeds a crowd of 4,000 compared to 5,000. If the number 5 was a Jewish number and the number 4 is a Gentile number, we have to realize that we're now dealing with the Decapolis, dealing with pagan Gentiles. Not only this, but Matthew doesn't include the detail of how many fish we've got. It's very specific in the feeding of the 5,000. You got 5 loaves, 2 fish, books of Moses, tablets of Moses. If I'm working with the Gentiles, do they have books of Moses? No. Do they have tablets of Moses? No. They don't have any of those things. What do they have to work with? Well, the Holy Spirit's like, well, we got some loaves. How many loaves? 7 loaves. How many fish? Don't know. Some fish. Doesn't matter. 7. We said 7 was the number of completion, but it's also got a Gentile meaning, which is the number of pagan nations from Joshua 3:10. I find it interesting that this story in a Jewish setting was very specific, and in a Gentile setting is very specific. The point seems to be after his encounter with the woman in Syrophoenicia that he realizes, maybe he's always realized, but now it's just time, that it's not just the books of Moses people he's supposed to be going to. He comes down, he goes right along the Sea of Galilee, he goes back to the Decapolis, and now he wants to teach his disciples another lesson. Not only am I enough for the Jewish people, I'm also the Messiah for the Gentile nations. If you're like, Jeremy, you're really doubling down on this numbers thing, you betcha I am. But consider the story that follows next in the narrative of Matthew. But first, let's point out one thing before we move on. The disciples in both these stories say, we're in a remote place. Where are we going to get enough food? I think a lot of us read that and we're like, wow, way to go, disciples. You made the same mistake twice. But the problem here, if the problem in the first story was it's close to Passover, the problem here is that they're in the Decapolis. And they can't go into a pagan market to buy food because that would make them unclean, and the food's unclean. They can't eat here. They can't get fruit from here. They have a food problem this time. Let's read the next section, Matthew 16. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, when evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red, and in the morning, today will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Jesus' point is, you guys are working really hard here. I'm a rabbi trying to teach you stuff, and you know how to do basic life things like discern the weather, but, work with me. Jesus goes on to say, a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Jesus then left them and went away. Now he's apparently back to Magadan. That's on the other side. It's back on the side of the sea. And now the Pharisees have come to him and they want a sign. Jesus just got done with a little special field trip with his disciples over on the other side of the sea. And Jesus is like, you want a sign, but no sign will be given to you except the sign of Jonah. Now we have to go back to our mind a few classes ago. You'll remember we talked about the sign of Jonah all the way back. And it appears to me Matthew was very strategic in how he references this. He doesn't do the whole 3 days and 3 nights in the earth, which is what we wrestled with earlier. There's no reference here to the resurrection. Jesus' point here cannot be the resurrection. That's not the sign of Jonah. Here the reference seems to be a clear reference to Gentiles, which is what we suggested a few weeks ago with Jesus' original point about the sign of Jonah. You want another sign? Maybe this is the second time the Pharisees have asked for a sign. Jesus is like, you still want a sign? I'm telling you, Jesus is saying to these Pharisees, these Gentiles get it. I was just on the other side of the lake. Let's keep reading. When they went across the lake, the disciples forgot to take bread. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They discussed this among themselves and said, is it because we didn't bring any bread? Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? What did we say last week that yeast represents? Sin. Beware of the sin of the Pharisees. Now, what have we been teaching all the way up to this point that the sin of the Pharisees is? What is Matthew's agenda? It's the mumser, the outcast. They don't care about the outcasts. Jesus has just gone over to the other side of the lake, fed 4,000 outcasts to make a point to his disciples. I'm enough for the Jews and for the Gentiles. Get back in the boat, go over to the other side of the lake. The Pharisees say, I want a sign. Jesus left them and went away. And then the next verse says, when they went across the lake, that they have this conversation on the boat. As Matthew records this narrative, his response is, beware of their teachings and beware of their sin, because they're going to teach you not to do the things that I'm trying to impress on you, which is going to the Decapolis, which is finding the Gentiles, which is feeding 4,000. Beware of their yeast. And it's like the disciples are like, oh gosh, we forgot to bring bread. We don't have any bread. We forgot to pack a lunch. We're going to jump over to Mark in just a moment. I think Mark does this chronologically much better, but Matthew tells us in such a way it's a little mushy, and there's a bunch of argument about how to harmonize this section of the gospel and where to put it. But Matthew is trying to put things in particular order here with the Pharisees and the encounter of the yeast and all of that. But if we back up just a little bit, let's read this again. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked, you of little faith, why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Do you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teachings of the Pharisees and Sadducees. If you're still struggling with the numerology thing, there you go. Jesus just let his disciples know, correcting them by saying, do you really not get this? Do you not understand? Do you not understand these numbers? 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 people, 12 baskets, 7 loaves, 7 baskets. He even points out the number. Anyway, let's go all the way back and pick up the Sermon on the Mount, chapters 5 through 7. After the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to have some encounters with people who land outside the lines. They're outside of bounds. They are mamzers, and he's amused by their faith. If you remember the Roman centurion, I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel, Jesus said. In order to make this point, it appears that Jesus travels to the Decapolis, heals a demoniac, the most unclean of the unclean. Jesus then comes back to the triangle and he teaches the people of God about his kingdom. He is pronouncing once again the agenda of the Mumser. Then Jesus attempts to get away to some solitude, but is followed by the crowds. Jesus seizes the opportunity and feeds 5,000 in order to teach the disciples about his mission. The next story is Peter walking on the water, which, by the way, could be seen as an affirmation that the disciples have what it takes to do what Jesus is telling them to do, because in the feeding of the 5,000, it appears that a major part of the teaching is Jesus saying, I'm going to take the law and I'm going to give it to you. Jesus doesn't wander around and hand out bread and fish. Jesus says, I'm going to take the law, give it to you, disciples, and you disciples are going to spread that law and bring the kingdom. I feel like most of the time you read it and it's like, oh, well, the disciples are just, interns, but that's not what Jesus is doing with it. Walking on water makes sense as the next story, because it's like Jesus is putting his stamp on his guys saying, you can do this, you can bring the kingdom. After that, Jesus finally does get away to Phoenicia to get a little R&R. And while there, he realizes that through this Canaanite woman, that maybe he is being called to be more intentional with the Gentiles. Maybe the Gentiles are ready. He now puts that lesson to action by traveling back to the Decapolis, feeding not 5,000, but 4,000. Finally, Jesus tells his disciples to beware of the sinful teaching of the religious leaders that will tell them that they shouldn't do Jesus' teaching, that they shouldn't go to the Decapolis. You shouldn't let them come in. You shouldn't feed 4,000 people. You should not care about the outcast. The mission of Jesus fits perfectly with Matthew's larger agenda of the outsiders. Now, if we go to Mark chapter 8, let's add this story that we're looking at into Matthew. Matthew doesn't include the story, but it is beautiful. They came to Bethsaida. This is Mark chapter 8, verse 22. Some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, do you see anything? He looked up and said, I see people. They look like trees walking around. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him saying, don't even go into the village. Is there something going on here that Jesus is doing on purpose when he heals, but doesn't heal this blind man? Notice, by the way, he gets into Bethsaida. He grabs a blind man and he takes him outside, because this guy is not just a blind man that needs healing. He's also an illustration. That can sound cold, but you have to understand that when Jesus does these miracles, he doesn't just do them to do the miracle. He does them to help people, but he also does them to prove a point to his disciples. Jesus cares about this man, but Jesus is going to use him to illustrate a point to his disciples. If you remember, when Jesus tells the disciples to beware of the yeast and the Pharisees and Sadducees, the text tells us that they are confused and begin discussing the food supply or lack thereof. Jesus' response seems to be, you've got to be kidding me. After all that, after the 5,000 and the woman with her daughter inside Phoenicia, the 4,000 and the Decapolis, and you still think I'm talking about food? Let's look at Mark's conversation. It happens on the boat. So, starting in verse 14. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them on the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, It is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? I noticed that verse is not in Matthew. But do you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. I love that Mark has them actually answer the question. When I broke up the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls or how many basket pieces did you pick up? They answered 7. And he said to them, Do you still not understand? It's even more clearly stated in Mark's record. Don't you get this? Don't you see what I'm doing? They pull the boat over. He grabs a blind man, takes him outside of town, heals him so that he can see, but he can't really see. Because what was the line he said to his disciples in the boat, Brent? Or to the disciples in the boat just then? Do you have eyes but fail to see? I think we can all agree that Jesus didn't not heal this guy all the way on. Like it wasn't an accident, right? He completes the healing and then sends the guy on his way. Jesus asks them if they have eyes, but they cannot see. The rabbi promptly demands that they pull the boat over, goes into Bethsaida, grabs a blind man, pulls him outside town, heals him in a way that he has eyes and he cannot see. What did he just say to the disciples? He finishes the healing of the man and sends him on his way. This is a perfect example of Jesus' miracles, not just being a miracle, but being a teaching tool. Jesus' point still stands out to his disciples. I'm here to reach the whole world. This kingdom business is about everybody. All the people you thought were out are more in than you ever realized. Watch out for the religious. They're not going to like this message. And now, this is one of my favorite teachings. I really wish I could do this with y'all in person, but it's still going to be good, y'all. All right. They're in the Decapolis. They healed the blind man. And now Jesus says, I'm going to take him somewhere that's really going to mess him up. Because sometimes Jesus just has to do that to us, you know? They are going to go to Caesarea Philippi. Now, if we go back to the Old Testament, in this region is a hotbed for Baal worship. We've talked about Baal. We've talked about the Phoenicians. We talked about in Genesis class what the Canaanite creation narrative was, kind of a little bit about Baal. Baal was very prominent in the worship of the Assyrians, the Canaanites, the Phoenicians. The nuances changed depending on which country you might be in, but there was a lot of consistency to Baal worship. Baal was seen almost without exception as the god of agricultural fertility. He was the god that would bring rain. Thunder was his voice. Lightning was his weapon. And rain was his quote unquote gift to the earth. Water was the common image of Baal. It represented his seed, if you will. Therefore, whenever you would find springs or a water source in the ancient world, especially if it was coming from underground, it immediately got a Baal connection. This location here in the Old Testament would have been a major, major Baal worship hotspot. You got this water source flowing out of the rock face. In Jesus' day, Josephus, well, and historians think he exaggerates this, but he said that they put a weight on a cord to find the bottom of the spring, to find where the spring went, and it just went on for miles and miles. Probably an exaggeration. Not sure how long the rope they had was, but probably a little bit of exaggeration. Nevertheless, it's a very deep spring. So let's look at some pictures. Well, we'll do that in a second. But if you can see if I can get my pointer over here. So this right here was supposed to be a temple to Zeus. This is actually not the spot that it was in. It was in a different spot because we wouldn't be blocking this hole, because this is the hole that the water would be coming out of. Okay. So there's still water coming out of it. It's not exactly the same as it was a couple thousand years ago, but this spot is actually one of the headwaters of the Jordan River. This is the Hashbani River. It flows from the northwest foot of Mount Hermon in Lebanon. Caesarea Philippi is at the foot of Mount Hermon. The other two are the Dan River, that's located in Israel, and the Benias River, that flows from the Golan Heights. Today, there's still a water source there, beautiful water flowing over terraces, but not nearly the amount that would have been coming out at this point in time. So, a little bit of Canaanite cosmology here. This is how the Baal myth goes. In the winter, everything begins to die. This is because Baal has left the earth and has gone down into the underworld, and he pursues his mistress, and according to its country, the mistress changes, but in the Old Testament, it's Ashtoreth or Asherah. Baal is pursuing Ashtoreth, his mistress, and she is the god of sexual fertility. Two fertility gods, one of agricultural, one of human. And Baal pursues her, and she teases him, and teases him, and teases him, and teases him to the point where, let's just say, he produces the rainy season. Baal produces rain, watering the earth, bringing life to everything around us, which is why in the spring, Baal grows weary of this game every year and comes back from the underworld. And that's when the agricultural stuff springs back to life. Baal has now returned to the land of the living. This myth will eventually evolve after the Old Testament. This myth in those days of the kings and the judges, this myth will be taken by the Greeks, and it will move from Baal worship to another god named Pan, who is a Greek god. He is also a god of sexual fertility and, ironically, shepherds. At least in some ways. There'd be lots of options with Greek god, but the one they pick is Pan. This place is actually called Peneus. Or when you put it in the Roman language, Banaeus. It comes from Peneus, named after Pan, to Banaeus in the Roman world. When you're talking about Herod the Great when Herod the Great dies, he divides up his kingdom. He splits it between his three sons. We have Philip all the way in the north, and you have Antipas in the central part of the kingdom. Then you have Archelaus all the way in the south. Now, Philip runs this region. This region is named Caesarea Philippi because Philip, in an effort to gain admiration of Caesar, because obviously Herod the Great, his dad, was a really good friend of Caesar's, even built him a city on the coast that we sometimes call Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea Maritime, Caesarea by the sea. That's actually where Pilate would have lived most of the time. It has a famous harbor. Herod the Great built it. It was one of those constructions that we're still not sure how he built it. People sometimes, excuse me, I got lost here. Now, why here? Why does Philip build this new Caesarea here? Well, there's several reasons. The big one is that there's a festival here that is a celebration of Pan every year at this temple. The festival is called Pandemonium. That's where we get the word pandemonium. Would have been a lot of consumerism, a lot of money, a lot of commercialism. It was a big deal. Philip wants to turn all that into some economic energy, and bless Caesar with it. he builds this place up for Pandemonium, and that's where you end up getting Caesarea Philippi. They celebrate and worship Pan. This is a Pan cult, which is also a sexual fertility cult. It's not Baal worship, but it has a lot of the same similarities. They have a 6-foot statue, golden statue of a piece of man's anatomy at this temple. They will put it on a cart during Pandemonium, and they will cart it down the main streets of Caesarea Philippi. It makes Las Vegas look like child's play. This is nothing. It doesn't hold Mardi Gras, Spring Break. Don't hold a candle to Pandemonium. While the women are following the statue around, the men are actually in another part of the temple grounds, dancing with the goats is what they called it. In the temple of the dancing goat. Because Pan, if you look at any old paintings of him, is a dancing goat. He's a satyr, half goat, half man. I don't know if I need to say anything else about that. It was really bad. We talk about how bad our society is today. That was bad. This place, Caesarea Philippi, the Temple of Pan, Banias, whatever, had a Roman name, a secular name. It was called the Gates of Hell, or the Gates of Hades. Literally, you have the water coming out of this mysterious water source from this unknown underground spring. And they saw that as this place. This is where Baal goes into the underworld. This is where Pan comes from one reality to the other. This is the gates where the underworld meets our world and where all this fertility comes from. Chapter 16. Excuse me for just a moment. Starting in verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." So Jesus arrives in this region of Caesarea Philippi. If the disciples are having a hard time being in the Decapolis, they are crawling out of their skin here at Caesarea Philippi. This is the most pagan, most hedonistic, most secular, non-Jewish place they could be in. This is going to be rough. We don't know what time it is. We don't know if it was during Pandemonium. We don't know if it's the quiet time of the year. We don't know if it's, Bike Week at Myrtle Beach or if it's December at Myrtle Beach, but it's one or the other. They get here, and Jesus says, "Who do people say that I am?" This is a true rabbi mode. He's pulled them out of their context, out of their comfort zone, put them in this situation and asked an intentional question. Who do people say that I am? Some say John the Baptist. That makes sense, especially if John the Baptist might have been his rabbi. He would look like John the Baptist. He would act like John the Baptist. He would give good rabbinical answers. Some say Elijah. Makes me wonder if Jesus maybe had a little more chutzpah than we give him credit for. Some say Jeremiah. And then, which is weird to me. Why of all the prophets, Jeremiah, not Isaiah, not Ezekiel? If I had to guess, it's because Jesus is going around saying, "Forgive your enemies, forgive your enemies." And what was Jeremiah known for? He was the weeping prophet. His message that God gave him is all about just give up, give in to Babylon, surrender to the Babylonians. Like, Jeremiah's message in itself is like, Babylon's out to get you. And if you run and try to run away from it, they're just going to get you worse. I'm wondering if his forgiveness message is being perceived as being pro-Roman. So they're like, that dude's Jeremiah. Let's pick up where we left off. "What about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, Mashiach, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven." That, my friends, that is sod. We've talked about Pardes, about Jewish hermeneutics, Peshat, Remez, and Drash, but then there's sod. Sod is something that you can't be taught. Sod is something that only the Lord can give you. Jesus is like, Peter, you just got sod. Only God could have given you that gift. You didn't deduce this. We didn't teach you this. The connection he just made is very intentional. The thing he said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Son of the living God only shows up a few times in the Bible. I wonder if Peter is pointing back to one of those times. Peter is clearly the leader of the disciples. He's probably the oldest. Because he's the only one we know that has a wife. And I'm wondering if Peter is referencing Joshua 3:9, which we've talked about a couple times. We just haven't read it yet. It's the same passage that talks about the 7 pagan nations. Jesus said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. And this is how you will know the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites." This is how you will know that the living God is among you. Just wonder why he picked that phrase, living God. He was using David and Goliath. I wonder if Peter is still prescribing to the idea that Jesus is here to get the pagans, not get them as in save them, get them as in get them, like take care of them, punish them. The 7 nations are right there, and they're just in the middle of this very pagan place. Jesus' response is also interesting. Jesus says, "Oh, Peter, you've just been given this sod." Now, either Peter doesn't realize what he just said, or maybe Peter actually been in another passage and Jesus is pulling him to a different passage. Because the first mention you see of the living God is in Deuteronomy 5. These are the commandments, Deuteronomy 5. These are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to your whole assembly there on the mountain from out of the fire, the cloud, and the deep darkness. He added nothing more. Then he wrote them on 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. When you heard the voice out of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leaders of your tribes and the elders came to me and said, "The Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty, and we have heard his voice from the fire. Today we have seen that a person can live, even if God speaks with him. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the fire, as we have and survived? Go near and listen to all that the Lord our God says. Then tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you. We will listen and obey." So is it Joshua? Is it Goliath? Or is it Deuteronomy 5? What's the next little bit of Deuteronomy 5 say? It says, "The Lord heard you when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard what these people say to you. Everything they said was good. Oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me and keep all my commands always, so it might go well with them and their children forever." God hears their hearts and goes, "That's good. I wish their hearts would always stay this way." Let's finish this in Matthew 16. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he orders his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Here it is. On this rock I will build my church. And this one statement causes so much disagreement among brothers. Centuries of debate. So let's break it down. Catholic perspective. On this rock I will build my church. Our Catholic brothers and sisters would say that the rock is Peter. Peter is the rock, the first pope, the first papal authority. That's what Jesus is building his church on. And I don't even think that that's wrong. Peter was the leader of the early church. You don't have to be fully Catholic to understand the papacy in the same way that it's obvious to recognize that Peter is the first leader. Peter means rocky, is what it means. He gets his name changed from Simon, somebody who listens, to Petros, not Petra. Petra is like bedrock, cliff face. But he names him Petros, Peter, rocky, which is a whole other explanation there, but don't have time to talk about it now. He named him Rocky, and after this moment, this is a literal turning point, life-defining moment in Peter's life. Now, Protestants. As Protestants, what do we say? On this rock I will build my church. What is the rock? That is the statement that Peter makes, the confession that Jesus is the Messiah. In this profession of faith, that rock, that confession of Jesus' lordship as Lord and Savior, that is going to be what the church is built on. That is good Protestant theology, and it is not wrong. I think that is definitely at here. So both of those are right. But I think there's something more. You see, there's this thing about rabbinical teaching. There's a rule that a rabbi will never talk about something he can't point to. So why on earth drag these 12 Jewish boys all the way up to Caesarea Philippi, to the heart of hedonism and paganism and idol worship, of depravity and all this stuff? Why take them up here just to ask them a question? Well, let's talk about what Jesus is standing in front of. Let's see. Right here. This is the rock face at Caesarea Philippi, where you see the cave all the way to the left, the dark cave all the way on the left. That's where the water comes out. That is the water source. You are looking at the gates of hell. The next picture here, that's the cave, and it's changed over time. It's gotten a lot bigger. Things have collapsed and fallen in over the centuries. But that was the cave out of which water flowed. These massive springs that came together, that underwater source came out of the cave. Now, if you're standing looking at the cave and you turn 90 degrees to your right, this would be the Grotto of Pan. This is where that statue stood. In fact, there's a large place where it's perfect, that it definitely stood. And there's also these tiny little niches. That's probably where the big statue was. And there's these tiny little things built into the side of the cliff face where there would have been little idols, little statues of Pan. Now, there would have been a temple to Pan here, a temple to Zeus here. Over here would have been where the dancing goat festivities would have taken place. The theater of the dancing goats. There you go. Now, Jesus is standing right here, somewhere in here, talking to his disciples about this. So when Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it," what is he pointing at? Is he pointing at Peter? Is he pointing to the confession? I would like to posture that he points right behind himself. Yes, Peter the rock is the rock. Yes, the confession is the rock. It's all good theology, but rabbinically, the rock that Jesus is pointing at is the gates of hell themselves, the center of pandemonium. She is saying, I'm not going to build my church exclusively in the Galilee. I'm not even going to build my church exclusively in Jerusalem. I'm going to build my church right here. In the mess, in the chaos, in the paganism, in the revelry, and none of it is going to stop what I'm going to do. I'm building my church, and I'm bringing the kingdom right here. In fact, I'm building my church on top of this. I'm going to bring peace to the most incredible chaos, and the gates of hell themselves will not be able to overcome it. So what does that mean for us? I think this means that Jesus' movement, Jesus' kingdom, has an offensive strategy. It's not a defensive one. I grew up with a faith that worked hard to play it safe. A faith that said, don't go to dangerous places, to stay in your holy huddle. It looks like Jesus is running into the chaos with kingdom and with peace. He's looking for places where it's needed the most, and he's employing it at the most chaotic points. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the others, the chief priests and the teachers of the law. And then he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Oh, Peter. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said. This shall never happen to you. Oh, this doesn't seem like a good idea, does it? Rebuking the rabbi. Peter's having a good day, and it's about to not be good anymore. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You're a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." Peter's best day is also his worst day. His rabbi just called him Satan, the accuser, the opposer. This is a rabbinic way of looking at Peter and saying, Peter, I love you, but you've forgotten your place. I'm the rabbi. You are the disciple. Those words of Deuteronomy 5 that we just read. Who can hear the voice of the living God? It's like Jesus is saying, Peter, you guys take a step back and listen. Let's keep reading. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what he has done. Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. All right. I have sort of a hot take on this. Let's talk about it. If we look at the three synoptic gospels, which record this story and try to harmonize them for a lack of, whatever, try to pull all these stories together and make sense out of the different records, because it's different in Matthew than it is in Mark. So if you're Mark, then it's Luke. They're all different records with different details, slightly different. Now in Matthew makes it sound like that whole conversation was with who? Jesus and his disciples. But if you look at Mark and Luke, especially Luke, the record actually says he turns and says to the crowd, now wait a minute. Why is there a crowd? He's not in the Galilee. This is as Gentile as Gentile gets. So that means that if there's a crowd, ain't nobody Jewish besides Jesus and the disciples here. If they're at the temple of Pan, what are they doing? Probably worshiping Pan. It sounds like at the end of the story, it's like ending and picking up another story, because it starts from that time on. Jesus began to explain. We read that as a break, and then it starts a new story. But when you look at the other Gospels, I don't think it reads that way. I think we're supposed to read it as this moment that Jesus starts telling them this new narrative piece, but they're still standing there. They're still in the same spot. And Mark and Luke make that more clear. It's a more seamless transition, one interaction, and that makes the crowd, the pagans here in Caesarea Philippi, you go back and read those words again. Let's read these words again as if he's saying them to pagans. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. Whoever loses their life for me will find it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is going to come in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. The other Gospels add another statement. They say, Jesus says to his disciples, anyone who is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of them before my Father. And I wonder if Jesus turns and he shouts this to the crowd in this horribly uncomfortable setting, and the disciples are, just downcast and trying to make themselves look as small as they can, because they're like, oh, Jesus, please, not here, not like this. And he turns and he looks at them in the face and he says, anyone who is ashamed of me, I will be ashamed of him before my Father. Don't you be ashamed of me as I sit here and tell you that this is where we're going to build the church. All right, guys, we're almost done. Let's keep moving. Matthew chapter 17. I'm going to take a water break. Just a second. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. Yes. And led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Can we all agree this is a weird story? As you read the Gospels, almost every story you come across is like a teaching. But this is not a teaching. This is just an event. What is the point of the story? First of all, which mountain? Because tradition would tell us, let's just look here for a second. Tradition would tell us, this is the region that they're in, that they traveled down to this mountain. This is Mount Tabor, Tabor. This is the traditional location. And there's a lot of reasons they chose it. One of them is that it says 6 days later, and Mount Tabor is about a 6 day journey away. Mount Tabor is a high mountain. It fits the story. There's some reason to think it's Mount Tabor, but I don't think it is. I think what's more likely is it's Mount Hermon. You can see Mount Hermon kind of up here. Mount Hermon is the mountainside that sits just behind Caesarea Philippi, which was the mountain in our last story. That was where the headwaters of the Jordan River, one of them comes flowing off of Mount Hermon. And Caesarea Philippi sits right at the base of Mount Hermon. Hermon, by the way, means holy mountain. Mount Hermon, it was 6 days later. So why 6 days later? It's not 6 days away. They're already there. They're literally at the base of Mount Hermon when Caesarea Philippi and the great confession of Peter happened. So why 6 days later? Could it be that it is in the text? Have we heard a story like this before? There's a high mountain. There are 3 people that are going up the mountain with a leader: Jesus, Peter, James, and John. A cloud covers the mountain. We're told that glory comes down on the mountain and that their leader's appearance has changed. The glory settles on the mountain. This all happens after 6 days, and God speaks. That sounds a lot to me. There's Mount Hermon. Sounds a lot to me like this. This sounds a lot like Moses going up to get the 10 Commandments. Let's go back to Mount Sinai. How about 3 people go up with a leader, who would be Moses? Moses takes with him Aaron, Joshua, and Hur up to the mountain. A cloud covers the mountain. There's a cloud on Mount Sinai. The glory of the Lord settles on Mount Sinai. And then Moses' face becomes radiant from the glory that is on the mountain. We're also told in Sinai, if you go back and look at it, that it all happens after 6 days. And of course, God speaks. So this is without a doubt, as you're reading the story from a Jewish perspective with a Jewish ear, this is Jesus replaying the story of Mount Sinai. Let's keep reading. Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Well, here's Peter. This is where we take the opportunity to beat up on Peter. Honestly, Peter's an easy target, but I love Peter. Peter's a lot like me. Can't believe how many times I've heard someone be like, well, here's Peter opening his big mouth, But maybe that's not what's happening here. Maybe. I'm so sorry. Maybe Peter knows his text better than we do. Because what happens after Moses comes down from Mount Sinai? Well, technically, he comes down and then there's a golden calf, and then he goes back up. But when he comes back down at the end, they build a tabernacle, which is the word shelters. Peter knows what happens next in the story. Of course, we don't pick any of that up because we've never connected it with Sinai. But I digress. You would think, also, just to harp on this a little bit longer, you would think that Peter really wants to get this right. Peter just got called Satan. He's probably looking to nail this one, Anyway. Let's keep reading. Then it says, while he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. A lot of people assume that God kind of interrupts Peter right here. I don't think that's happened because God never addresses Peter. Actually, it seems like God's just wants to get in on the action. This is my son, whom I love, and in him I'm well pleased. Most of us don't realize that God shows up in all 3 parts of his book. In a Jewish way of dividing up the Old Testament, you'd have the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and the Ketuvim, which is the writings. Think of the books of history, the Psalms, the Proverbs. And in this quote, he quotes from all 3. This is my son, whom I love. With him I'm well pleased. So let's go section by section. Let's read Psalm 2, verse 7. I will proclaim the Lord's decree. He said to me, you are my son. Today I have become your father. Psalm 2. That's going to be which part of the Old Testament? Ketuvim. He's got the writings. God says, this is my son. That's Ketuvim, whom I love, and who I'm well pleased, depending on your gospel. Go ahead and let's look at Isaiah 42. Here is my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen one, in whom I will delight. I will put my spirit on him, and he will bring justice to the nations. All right, so we had Ketuvim. This one is Nevi'im. This is the prophets. writings and we got the prophets. Now we're going to look towards the Torah. Deuteronomy 18, verse 15. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. You must listen to him. The great passage about the second Moses, literally the Messiah in later Jewish thought, the second Moses figure. God quotes all three parts of his book. The writings, this is my son, the prophets whom I love and who I delight. Listen to him from Deuteronomy, the books of Moses. All three parts of the books are quoted. It's almost like God's not chastising Peter at all. Peter's like, I get it, Jesus. This is like Exodus. Let's build a tabernacle. I love that God quotes his own book. That's amazing. If we want to also recognize that Moses and Elijah are here, Moses represents the law. Elijah represents the prophets. Moses and Elijah also both had encounters with God on a mountain very similar to this, Mount Sinai. That's where Elijah heard the still small voice as he was in the cave. That's where Moses received the law. They both saw the Lord or interacted with the Lord on these spots. Also, we're not entirely sure where Mount Sinai was. We would assume it's somewhere down towards the desert in between Egypt and Israel, but we don't have like a definite location. What's interesting about Jesus hanging out with Elijah and Moses is there's only two stories about the Messiah, Elijah and Moses. One is right here in our Gospels. The other one is found in the Midrash. But this Midrash that we're about to look to, remember the Midrash is more like ancient Hebrew Bible commentary that they tell through stories. But it's built around Psalm 43. Fun fact, Psalm 42 and 43 were one psalm in the original Torah. We split into two, but read them together. It makes a lot of sense. Psalm 43, vindicate me, my God, and plead my cause against an unfaithful nation. Rescue me from those who are deceitful and wicked. You are God, my stronghold. Why have you rejected me? Why must I go about mourning, oppressed by my enemy, by the enemy? Rather, send me your light and your faithful care. Let them lead me. The psalm and the psalmist is crying out. Now, the Midrash is just trying to comment on the psalm. The psalmist is crying out for vindication. He's oppressed. He's in trouble. The psalmist is crying out for God's rescue, his deliverance, his vindication. He prays and says, God, send out your light and your truth. Now, the Midrash goes on to say, we know who the truth was, who is super passionate about the truth, who is all the time getting into King Ahab's face with his fire chutzpah. Elijah. Elijah was all about truth. But now who gave us the truth? Technically God, but through Moses. Through Moses, he gives us the truth. He gives us the Torah. Moses is giving Torah. In the Midrash, it says, we know who truth is. Truth is Moses. Moses, truth is Elijah. These are the characters we're looking for. In this Messianic age, we're looking for the second Moses, and we're looking for that coming of Elijah. When the psalmist cries out for truth, when the psalmist is really crying out for his deliverance. But he also cries out for not just truth, but light and faithfulness. But faithfulness, the word for faithfulness is matai. Asking for light. Asking for light and asking for truth. Matai is truth. Moses and Elijah represented the truth part. So we need the light part. Well, we read Isaiah, and it will go on to say that Messiah, the one whom may have chosen, the one in whom I delight, he will be a light. The servant will be a light to the nations. The Midrash, Psalm 43 says, you see, the light is Messiah, and the truth is Moses and Elijah. It's the only Midrash, it's the only story outside the New Testament Gospels that puts the Messiah, Moses, and Elijah together. This Midrash goes on to say, when you are in trouble, when you need vindication and deliverance, Pray for Moses. Pray for Elijah. And pray for Messiah. Pray for light. Pray for truth. Listen to the rest of Psalm 43, brothers and sisters. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to the place where you dwell. Then I will go to the altar of God, to God my joy and my delight. Bring me where? Holy mountain. Mount Hermon? What does it mean? Holy mountain. To the place where you where? To you where you what? Dwell. This psalm, which is the only other midrash, only other writing with these three characters, is a perfect psalm for the transfiguration story. Let's go ahead and finish up. I will praise you with lyre, O God, my God. Why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Put your hope in God. I will yet praise him, my Savior and my God. By the way, one more note in the why I think this is Mount Hermon. Peter writes in his letters, First and Second Peter, he talks about how he was with James and John and Jesus on the Holy Mountain. I'm telling you, I think it's Mount Hermon. The psalmist cries out for deliverance. He pleads for God to send him his truth and his light. Why is the psalmist asking for that? The Midrash teaches that God's truth is seen in Moses, in the Torah, in the prophets, in Elijah, who had the passion for truth, and that Messiah, Jesus, is the light. The light of God that is sent forth. When you are in trouble, pray for Messiah. Maybe Peter knew the Exodus part. Maybe Peter didn't even realize how good of a point he was making. This is an amazing teaching buried in the story of the Transfiguration. Well, we still don't have this story fully fleshed out as far as a drosh. I think it's great. It's interesting. I have a hunch here. The story appears in 3 Gospels, almost always at the Dead Center. What do we suppose when we find something like this at the Dead Center? We would assume it's a chiasm. Now, if that's true in one of the Gospels, this is the defining moment. It could be true in Matthew. And we haven't talked about this, but Matthew is divided into 5 movements. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Matthew is a Jewish gospel, and its gospel is divided into 5 movements. Now, one of the things that we see here is this, if this is chiastic, which I'm not sold on yet, I had to do more work. It's almost like on the first half of the chiasm, whether it's in Matthew or Mark or Luke, on the first half, it's like Jesus is telling his disciples the first half of Torah. This is what the partnership's going to look like, guys. This is what you guys need to learn. Jesus has gotten done teaching them a pretty big lesson. I'm here for the Gentiles. I'm here for the marginalized. This doesn't look like what you think it's going to look like. This is 3-part eschatology, not 2-part eschatology. But at the end of the Transfiguration, at this point, this is where Jesus' messaging is going to change, where he starts talking about, it's time to live this out because I'm going to Jerusalem to die. Everything seems to hinge on these things that happen in this short little time, from this Canaanite woman to here. Something signals to Jesus that it's time to move into phase 2 of his plan. Let's jump back into Deuteronomy 5 for a second. Let's read these 2 paragraphs again. These are the commandments the Lord proclaimed in a loud voice to the whole assembly there on the mountain, from out of the fire, the cloud, and the deep darkness. Nothing more than he wrote them on the stone tablets and gave them to me. When you heard the voice of the darkness while the mountain was ablaze with fire, all the leaders of your tribes and your elders came to me, and you said, the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his majesty. We have heard his voice from the fire. Today we have seen that a person can live even if God speaks with him. But now, why should we die? This great fire will consume us, and we will die if we hear the voice of the Lord our God any longer. For what mortal has ever heard the voice of the living God speaking out of fire, as we have and survived? Go near and listen to all the Lord our God says. Then tell us whatever the Lord our God tells you, and we will listen and obey. The Lord heard you when you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard what this people said to you. Everything they said was good. Oh, that their hearts would be inclined to fear me and keep all my commands always, so that it might go well with them and their children forever. Go tell them to return to their tents, but to stay here with me, that I may give you all the commands, decrees, and laws you are to teach them to follow in the land I am giving them to possess. Tell them to return to their tents. Let's keep moving. God speaks from heaven. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified, but Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The disciples asked him, why then did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah came and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him. But you have done to him everything they wished, but have done to them everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. The disciples understood that he was talking about John the Baptist. Okay. They have these theological questions. They're coming back down the mountain. They're asking Jesus some stuff. They just saw Elijah. They just saw Moses. This is a big deal. They still have this idea, though, of a revolution. This Isaiah, this two-part eschatology of overthrowing Rome, taking back the land. Jesus is telling them over and over again, that's not what we're about. That's not where you're headed. They ask this question about Elijah. He explains to them that John was Elijah. They get that part. What they don't get is this whole kingdom thing that Jesus is preaching about. And look, this is something not just the Zealots were about, but the Essenes, the Pharisees. I would say the Essenes would fit into a kind of a different category, but they believed in two-part eschatology. John the Baptist was probably an Essene. They think that they're going to bring the kingdom with swords, but God is doing it through Jesus, through the Messiah. They've identified the Messiah. They've got that part. They may not all be zealots, although at least a couple of them are, but they're getting like, okay, I get it. You're the Messiah. And I know that we're not like arming ourselves for battle, but we believe that you're going to do this. Jesus keeps trying to tell them, no, that's not what I'm doing. Let's keep reading. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. Lord, have mercy on my son, he said. He has seizures and suffers greatly. He often falls into the fire, into the water. I brought him into your disciples, but they could not heal him. You unbelieving and perverse generation, Jesus replied. Talk about wrestling with something. We have this Exodus story here up on Mount Sinai, and then we have, Peter mentioning the thing. But what did we talk about that happened in between Moses coming down and going back up? It was the golden calf. I wonder if there's a connection here because, they burned the golden calf and then they put it in the water and drank it. And this guy specifically mentions he falls into fire or into water. I don't know what's there. Let y'all figure that out. And let me know. Okay. All right. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me. Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of the boy, and he was healed at that moment. Then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked why they couldn't drive it out. He replied, because you have so little faith. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you. In another gospel, it says these kind of demons only come out with prayer and fasting, which is hard enough to kind of grasp. It almost feels formulaic, but we will resist the urge to be formulaic because that is very Western. In fasting, fasting is all about posture. Fasting is connected to humility. I wonder if what Jesus is saying here is you can't cast this demon out because you're trying to use this demon casting out stuff as something impressive you can do. This is about your position in the kingdom. You're trying to do this with authority. You're trying to do this out of humility. I wonder if there's like some connection here to idolatry. We can talk more about that later. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." And the disciples were filled with grief. After Jesus and his disciples arrived in Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma temple tax came to Peter and asked, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yes, he does," he replied. All right, they're back in the religious triangle. These guys come up to him and they're collecting the temple tax. Now, there's a lot of taxes in this day. We complain a lot about taxes in our country, but in the first century Jewish world, especially under Herod the Great and his sons, scholars estimate you were taxed somewhere between 70, 80, maybe even as high as 85% of your income. Romans took almost 50 to 60, and then you had your tithe, which is not a tax. Let's be careful of that language. It's not a tax, but you tithed because you were good Jewish people. You tithed 10% on top of your 50 or 60 from Rome, and then on top of that, another 10%, which Herod had levied against you to build this great temple mount, this big box, the second temple that he revitalized. And these people come up to him and they say, "So your rabbi pays this tax, right?" And I don't know if Peter knows for sure, but he's like, "Yep, sure does. Of course he does. Always does." And you know, Peter walks back. He made this commitment because, we've talked about this before. The rabbi's commitment, according to Jewish commitment, is stronger than a bond between the actual student and his parents after they've given him to the rabbi. It's the rabbi's job to take care and to watch over them and to pay for their things. Let's pick it back up. Peter comes in the house. Jesus is the first to speak. And he says, "What do you think, Peter? I heard you talking out through the, what is, hold on. I think I have that wrong in here. Let me read it to you. What do you think, Peter? Do kings tax their own people or the foreigners they have conquered? Or from whom do the kings of the earth collect duty and taxes, from their own children or from others? Is Herod supposed to be collecting a God tax? We understand that the Romans collect taxes. That's how taxes work. I wonder if this is coming from Jesus's interpretation of the text, because the text says you're not allowed to do this to your Israelite brother. You're allowed to do it to a foreigner. You're allowed to charge interest or taxes, or however you want to look at that according to Torah, but you're not allowed, talking about Herod's tax, a biblical tax. Peter said, "From others. Then the children are exempt," Jesus said to him. "But so that we may not cause offense, go to the lake and throw out your line. Take the first fish you catch, open its mouth, and you will find a 4 drachma coin. Take it and give it to them for my tax and yours." So I've been wrestling with what the remez is here. And I think I have something, but we'll talk about a couple other things first. Number one, why does he only pay for him and Peter? Well, to pay taxes, this tax specifically, you had to be 20 years old. So I would assume that probably Jesus and Peter, we talked about this, about the rest of them probably being teenage boys. Jesus and Peter are probably the only ones over 20, and Jesus is responsible for them. The only thing I have in the way of remez is from Habakkuk chapter 1, starting in verse 12. "Lord, are you not from everlasting? My God, my Holy One, you will never die. You, Lord, have appointed them to execute judgment. You, my rock, have ordained them to punish. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. Why then do you tolerate the treacherous? Why are you silent while the wicked swallow up those more righteous than themselves? You've made people like fish in the sea, like the sea creatures that have no ruler. Herod, as I mentioned, is a puppet king. The wicked foe pulls them up with hooks, just like Peter did, catches them in his net, gathers them up in his dragnet, and so he rejoices and is glad. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet, for by his net he lives in luxury and enjoys the choicest food. That just feels like a commentary on what Herod's doing. Is he to keep on emptying his net, destroying nations without mercy? If you have a better remez for that, let me know. I feel like Jesus is giving this commentary on Herod, because Herod is not rebuilding the temple because he wants to do something nice. He's rebuilding the temple because it looks good on him, and he's doing it to placate the people. Well, guys, I'm not sure how long we went. This feels like a long time. But we covered a lot of ground tonight. I didn't even show you this picture that I had of a fish with something in his mouth. Do you see that? I had to make sure y'all see all my slides. I will be sending this out along with the slide deck in just a couple minutes. You should be in your inbox Thursday morning. So thank y'all for your time. I hope this video was helpful and useful, and we will start in Matthew 18, I believe, next Tuesday. We only have 3 more weeks of class, so we've got to zoom through these next 10 chapters. But I love y'all. I appreciate y'all. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank y'all for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Goodbye.